everyone, my name is John Gillespie, and this is my video presentation on the Vietnam War, taking you from 1954 to the war's wind down in 1973. And we're also going to take a look at how the war impacted our memory and popular culture. So let's get going. But before we get into the Vietnam War, let's take a good look at the World War II Memorial. Look at how it's situated. Look at its symbolism. Look at how it doesn't shy from the light. It's bold, it's stone, it's triumphant, it's celebratory. It's even got a big pool of water in the middle of it, suggesting that it adds depth to our character and meaning. And here it is at night. We don't shy away from it. We don't hide it in the shadows. We light it up. It blazes forward, letting everybody know about this good war and the triumph of the United States and the triumph of democracy. It even has a little bit of a holiday-esque feel to it, with the wreaths that don each one of those pillars that surround the memorial. It certainly is inspiring. This is the Vietnam Memorial, on the other hand. Unlike the World War II Memorial, it does not reach to the sky. It does not look skyward. It does not try to inspire us or have us look beyond ourselves. It's actually a little bit below ground level in a sunken spot on the mall in Washington, D.C. You actually need to seek this one out. It doesn't jump out at you like the World War II Memorial. It's almost as if the artist wanted to purposely suggest that we're trying to hide something or that we have something to be ashamed of. Now, there are no people in this memorial. There are no soaring statues. What we do have is the name of every single one of the American servicemen who gave their lives in service of their country during the Vietnam War. And so I think this gives the suggestion that this is more of a tomb, more of a graveyard, and less of a triumphant memorial. There are three figures that are sort of an adjunct part of this memorial, and they represent three American servicemen of different races. It appears that they've emerged from the jungle. They're still holding their weapons. They're dirty and they're tired. And the looks on their faces suggest bewilderment, confusion, and even betrayal. And so moving into our understanding, our study of the Vietnam War, this is where I want to start. This is where I wanted you to think, because this is a war that's going to be very complicated, both in its design, its outcome, in its war aims, and how the public relates to it. So throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century, Westerners, Americans and Europeans, often referred to Southeast Asia as Indochina, and that means that this is the land that shares the influences, both politically, militarily, culturally, with China and India. It became French Indochina, according to Westerners anyway, when France established colonial control, that is, political hegemony, over the area in 1887. The Japanese, on their territorial march of conquest, they conquered the territory during World War II as part of their East Asian co-prosperity sphere, or so they said. After World War II, the UN permitted the French to regain control of the territory. Now, not everybody was happy with that. French hegemony was opposed by a Vietnamese European educated nationalist named Ho Chi Minh. Now, Ho Chi Minh declared the existence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in 1945. What kind of a country did he propose it to be? It was clearly nationalist. He clearly wanted to display and project the voice of the Vietnamese people, all of the Vietnamese people, both in the North and of the South. Where was he going to get his support? He was ambiguously leftist, leaning toward communism. Nevertheless, his Declaration of Independence that he issued in 1945 is striking in its similarity to another document we may know. It reads this: all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right there, we are quoting the American Declaration of Independence. We're quoting Thomas Jefferson, who is quoting John Locke. We are seeing the DNA of American or Western liberalism all through this document. He goes on, this immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. In a broader sense, this means all of the peoples on the earth are equal from birth. All of the peoples have a right to live, to be happy and free. Ho Chi Minh also sent a letter to President Truman of the United States asking him to consider Vietnam's entry into the United Nations along with the other, and I quote, other democracies. Well, the letter was either ignored or Harry Truman never saw it. We'll never know the answer to that one, but his plea to be included among the Western democracies was a call that went unanswered. Meanwhile, communist influences seemed to be gaining in Asia. In 1949, the Chinese nationalist Mao Zedong led a successful communist revolution in China, making this country the second major country to align itself with Marxist principles after the USSR in 1917. In 1950, communist forces in North Korea launched an attack on South Korea. This is beginning what we call the Korean War, and of course it ended in stalemate in 1953. Now, at the same time, a major development happened with Vietnam. The Soviet Union, the United States' arch-enemy in the geopolitical struggle for dominance, formally recognized Ho Chi Minh's independent government in Vietnam, underscoring the belief, for many, that the Soviet Union was behind an international communist conspiracy and wanted to spread communism throughout the world. Now, this takes form in what is known as the domino theory. The idea is that when one country goes communist, its neighbors will soon fall to those influences, and then the next one will fall to those influences, and the next one, and sooner or later, you will have communism on the steps of any town USA. Ho Chi Minh had a lot of popular support, both in the North and the South. He raised an impressive army and defeated the French at the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu in May of 1954. The French, it seemed, could no longer maintain control of Vietnam. Is this another domino falling? Is this another sign that communism is gaining inroads in Southeast Asia? The Geneva Conference of 1954 met the following day. Now, they had actually convened in April in order to deal with the fallout from the Korean War, and now this is another problem that has been forced on the agenda. They decided to do what they had done with Korea, and that is divide it. And so they took Vietnam and they divided it at the 17th parallel into two regions. South Vietnam would be oriented toward United States leadership. Now, the U.S. officially opposed the partition, but nevertheless did not deny the responsibility. The U.S. will be supported by Ngo Dien Diem. The North, on the other hand, would be under the control of Ho Chi Minh and his allies, presumably the Soviet Union and China. So here we have the Cold War and microcosm, the communist North and the supposedly free and democratic South. But as we're going to see, that's not exactly going to be the case. Elections were said to be held in 1956, but they never did happen. President Eisenhower was devoted to stopping the spread of communism in Asia. He advanced what we had said was the domino theory. Look at what he says. Finally, you have broader considerations that might follow what you would call the falling domino principle. You have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one. And what will happen to the last one is the certainty that it will go over very quickly. So you could have a beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influences. So as we said before, the fear is that if we allow one nation to adopt communism, then it will influence the next nation, and that will in turn influence the next nation. And like a row of dominoes, they will all fall over, and the entire world could be communist before we know it. Now, President Eisenhower's successor, John F. Kennedy, was a Democrat, unlike Eisenhower, who was a Republican, but he nevertheless embraced Eisenhower's opinions. He also believed that all communists were acting in concert with one another and that a worldwide communist conspiracy existed and was being directed by forces from Moscow. He said, "We have been able to hold this line against the internal subversion by the communists as well as the external threat of military invasion. We are assisting the people of Vietnam. If we stop helping them, they will become ripe for internal subversion and a communist takeover." You can see right there, he's voicing the same opinion that we have to stop it here, we have to stop it now, or like a row of dominoes, they will all fall over. So, Diem, South Vietnam, appealed to the United States for aid against the North, and Kennedy agreed. He approved $28 million to supply the South Vietnamese army and another $12 million to support the Civil Guard. He then also approved around 3,000 what we'll call military advisors to the South. And those so-called military advisors are going to grow to 16,000 by 1963. Now let's look at the South. Ngo Diem had U.S. support, but he was not what we would consider to be a good guy. His family personally held almost all political power, and he was really in opposition to the democracy that the United States claimed to be supporting in that region. He was a Roman Catholic in a largely Buddhist country. And now that is not a problem in and of itself, but he had a habit of torturing and imprisoning his Buddhist adversaries. Buddhist monks took to the streets and openly protested his regime through self immolation. That is, they set themselves on fire. In 1963, Kennedy, realizing that we could no longer support this guy, secretly approved the assassination of Diem. Now, Kennedy was assassinated himself 2 weeks later. Kennedy's successor, President Lyndon Johnson, didn't want a whole lot to do with this Vietnam thing. He wanted to be the great domestic president. He wanted to focus on his domestic agenda, the Great Society. He wanted to wipe out poverty, racism, fund education, build the arts. But he also knew that he had, well, a legacy to live up to. FDR had lost Poland in 1945. That's the language we often use to describe what happened there. Harry Truman lost China and a stalemate in Korea in 1953. President Eisenhower lost Cuba in 1959, and his successor, John F. Kennedy, also lost Cuba, continued to lose Cuba with the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And so President Johnson realizes he cannot be the next president to let yet another domino fall as he sees it. So he, like we said, doesn't want anything to do with Vietnam. He privately said, I just don't think it's worth fighting for. But when he is running for re-election against the hardline Republican Barry Goldwater, he is forced to take a strong stand against communism and show both the Republicans and the voters at large that he is not going to just stand there while communism makes its advances in Southeast Asia. He says, I'm not going to be the president who saw Southeast Asia go the way China went. So he looks to his chief advisor, a guy named Robert McNamara. And Robert McNamara tells him he needs to take a strong stand against Ho Chi Minh and tell him he will not make further advances in Southeast Asia. And he needs to reverse communist gains. It's not enough to contain communism, but reverse them. So in 1964, an incident happens in the Gulf of Tonkin in the waters of North Vietnam that Johnson believes will give him license to act. It's August 2nd when he receives a report that the U.S. cruiser, the USS Maddox, which was strangely patrolling North Vietnamese waters, has been fired upon. What's the evidence? A single bullet hole is discovered in the USS Maddox, not exactly lending credibility to this idea that an assault is happening. 2 days later, Johnson receives news of Vietnamese warships, but turns out they are false radar images. So we don't really have a whole lot to go on if we're trying to construct this story about a North Vietnamese attack on US forces in North Vietnamese waters. But it was enough, apparently, for Johnson to authorize a massive retaliatory strike against the North Vietnamese. And the move was largely political, and it worked. Here's what happened. Johnson's approval ratings in July were 42%. In August, after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, there was 72%. Congress then approved what's known now as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It says, the Congress approves and supports the determination of the President as Commander-in-Chief to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. And here's the next bit of that. The United States is, therefore, prepared, as the President determines, to take all necessary steps, including the use of armed force, to assist in the defense of freedom. Now, this is a striking document and a turning point in U.S. history and U.S. Foreign policy. Here's what it really says. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution authorizes the President to have unprecedented powers in U.S. history. The President has been given the power to use military force in Southeast Asia without congressional approval. You say, well, Congress actually approved it. Yes, Congress gave up its powers and gave them to a single man. No congressional vote, no formal declaration of war, and what you have is President Johnson, who is now authorized to escalate this military conflict in Southeast Asia, and he doesn't have to come back to Congress to check in. So for this reason, it's also known as Johnson's blank check. The American people will be footing the bill for Johnson's war on communism, which, according to the Gulf of Tonkin incident, may or may not actually exist in the way we believe it. Johnson wanted to end the war quickly. He wanted to get back to his domestic agenda. But Ho Chi Minh had settled in for a very long conflict. The American strategy is to get in there, shock and awe, and win. Now, the Vietnamese strategy is to not lose. Ho Chi Minh said it like this: "If we must fight, we will fight. You will kill 10 of my men, but we will kill one of yours. And in the end, it is you that will tire." So the Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, coined the term escalate or escalation. What this means is that the US should gradually increase military pressure to find the point at which the enemy would crack, but at minimal cost to the American taxpayer. So we're weighing the benefits of both. In theory, the US would demonstrate its commitment while leaving the door open to negotiate. Escalation was also a way to increase commitment without raising eyebrows among the American voter. There's not this huge escalation in troops, it's happening gradually over time, and people tend to notice that a little bit less. This policy, he said, should be carried out in a low-keyed manner to avoid undue concern and excitement in Congress and in domestic public opinion. So, in other words, do it slowly, you'll attract a lot less attention, and we will find the enemy's breaking point. So by the end of 1966, there were 185,000 US troops in South Vietnam. Johnson then moved very quickly to authorize what is known as Operation Rolling Thunder. This means a gradual and sustained bombing of North Vietnam to weaken morale and hopefully produce a. The objective in Operation Rolling Thunder is to bring the enemy to a ceasefire. And between 1965 and 1973, the US will drop more than 6 million tons of bombs on enemy positions. This is almost 3 times the amount of bombs dropped out by all combatants during the Second World War, putting this Vietnam military excursion into perspective for us. Here's a chart of the troop deployments and the troop surge that happened in Vietnam. So there we have President Kennedy. This is the levels under President Johnson. And by the time you get to the end of Johnson's term and you get to President Nixon, who we'll talk about, that's when we're going to start to see this increase. So take a look. We go to over 500,000 troops in Vietnam between 1961 and 1968. Just to recap where we've been, you have President Truman from 1947 to 1952, who abides by the ideology known as containment. We must keep communism in its place, keep it from spreading. His commitment is to support French imperial claims against the Vietnamese. By the time you get to President Eisenhower from 1953 to 1959, he also endorses the idea of the domino theory, which is a form of containment. But he says we must understand that we have to keep communism from spreading. We have to be where it is. If communism rears its head somewhere, we have to get there and keep it from moving on. And his commitment is $200 million a year to Diem and 657 military advisors. By the time we get to Kennedy, who's in office in 1960 and of course dies in 1963, he's also supportive of the domino theory. He increases the military aid, increases the so-called military advisors, and they go from 900 to 16,300. President Johnson from 1963 to 1968 also endorses the domino theory. And under him, we're going to authorize Rolling Thunder, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and the troop commitment is going to rise from 23,000 to 184,300 troops by 1968. The war on communism was far more expensive than Johnson's other war, the war on poverty. By 1967, the war's budget was $27 billion, pushing the federal deficit from $9.8 billion at the war's beginning to $23 billion by war's end. The unaccountable military spending would set in motion rampant inflation that would help to discredit the presidency of Jimmy Carter. Have a look at the military escalation. 1956, you're looking at 400,000 troops, and you're looking at 5,200 fatalities. 500, and then at the bottom, 1,200. Over 500, 17,000. By 1970, under 300. That's when Nixon comes. By the early 1960s, the Vietnam conflict was still largely supported. It was a popular war. It was overshadowed by its big predecessor, World War II, which is known as the Good War, and that Korean conflict is largely swept under the rug. This was seen as part of a larger American mission to combat communism, secure freedom around the globe, and even if the challenge was reluctantly accepted. LBJ said, "We did not choose to be the guardians at the gate, but there is no one else." But opposition to the Vietnam War and the American involvement in it began to grow after Rolling Thunder. The first rumblings of protests grew into a general revolt that sooner or later is going to draw in an entire generation. Well, contrary to popular mythology, the Vietnam era did not produce the first draft, that is, conscription into the army. Men have been drafted into every U.S. military conflict since the American Revolution. Also, every draft has had its share of objectors and draft dodgers. But like previous wars, the Vietnam conflict required a draft, and so the American government is doing nothing different, really. Now, you can legally get out of the draft. How can you legally get out of the draft? Well, you can claim bad health. You could have bad health. You could have dependent children that you need to support and can't go off to war. You can be a homosexual, and there is a longstanding ban on homosexuals in the American military. You could go to college or work in a so called critical occupation and get a draft deferment because of that. You could also illegally get out of the draft. How do you do that? You could go to Canada and flee and go and come back when the war is over, presumably. You could fake being a homosexual, and many people did during the Vietnam era. You could just ignore it and not go and assume that somebody's going to come hunt you down. And so here's another statistic to kind of put this in perspective. Of the 1,200 men who attended Harvard in 1970, 56 of them were drafted, and 2 of them actually saw combat in Vietnam, suggesting that the draft really did favor the recruitment of the lower classes, and the upper classes, the wealthy, the men with means, they found ways of getting out of it. By December 1969, the draft board instituted a lottery in order to choose who went and who stayed. Eligible men were chosen by birthday in the form of these little blue capsules that we pull out of a bowl. And here's what it looks like. Each draft night on TV, a different birthday was randomly chosen. You can see to the chart on the left the induction year, the drawing date, and the birth date that were chosen during that night. And so this gave rise to the phrase, "Your number is up," which we still use today. So back to the stirrings of protest. The first major signs of dissent was called a teach-in. This happened on college campuses. It was open discussion of the war, some discussion of its meaning and legitimacy, and it took place, as I said, largely in areas of higher learning. Teach-ins took the form and shape of the civil rights movement. And what they did was they legitimized protest to an extent, because in the early 1960s, universities were not yet associated with radicalism or with far left politics. But as a consequence of Vietnam, they're going to be. So why did these happen on colleges? Well, between 1946 and 1970, college enrollment jumped from 2 million to 8 million. And so the college student became something of a demographic. Education also transformed. Education went from an institution that was to transmit knowledge to one that focuses on critical thinking and inquiry. And nothing is worse for a war than critical thinking and inquiry, because we don't just follow orders, whether or not we think the war is right or whether or not it's wrong, whether it is in reality or not, but we have to openly discuss these things. And so this really takes a bite out of sort of blind enlistment, so to speak. The draft deferment until 1971 put those in opposition to the war in college. And so people could actually get out of going to the war by enrolling in college up until 1971. Protest against the war came to embrace a wider spectrum of Americans as well. It wasn't just college students. This included the famous Dr. Benjamin Spock, who wrote the baby book that so many baby boomers were raised on. There was also Jane Fonda, known as Hanoi Jane, a Hollywood personality that went to Vietnam and protested against the war off of U.S. soil. And then there was the Roman Catholic Church, which began to radicalized to an extent during the Vietnam period. You have people like Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, and Daniel Berrigan who raised serious questions about the US involvement in Vietnam, about the arms race, and about the fight against communism in general. So the anti war movement was associated, that is, in popular opinion, with something called the counterculture. So, what's the counterculture? Well, they're also known as the hippies. The hippies are hard to define, but we're going to try. They're, well, anti society. They're not organized. They're not necessarily intellectual. They were the ultimate underachievers. Timothy Leary, who comes to spearhead part of this movement, said, like every great religion of the past, we seek to find divinity within and to express this revelation in a life of glorification and the worship of God. These ancient goals were defined, we define in the metaphor of the present. Turn on, tune in, drop out. And that's sort of the rallying cry, the battle cry of the hippie. Turn on, tune in, drop out. But there is no identifiable hippie doctrine. You're not going to point to one thing and say all hippies do this or all hippies think that. But generally, they have a casual attitude towards sexuality, giving rise to the idea of free love. They have very few taboos about psychedelic drugs, which are used to expand consciousness and your mind. And there's a general indifference to society and its norms. So one of the ways that we can explain the hippie is to look at the books that they read. Now, the hippies didn't do a whole lot of reading. Don't get that impression, but still they absorbed some of the ideas that were floating around academia. One of the places we can look is academic and psychologist Norman O. Brown, the so-called prophet of the counterculture. He was a Freudian psychologist who published the book Life Against Death in 1959. The basic thesis is that human beings are unhappy because we repress our basic instincts. And so, in order to be happy, what we must do is embrace those instincts, giving rise to the phrase, if it feels good, do it. He writes, mankind is still, today, is still making history without having any conscious idea of what it really wants, or under those conditions, it would really stop being unhappy. In fact, what it is doing seems to be making itself more unhappy and calling that unhappiness progress. He says, for 2,000 years or more, man has been subjected to a systematic effort to transform him into an aesthetic animal. He remains a pleasure-seeking animal. Freedom is poetry, taking liberties with words, breaking the rules of normal speech, violating common sense. Freedom is violence. Another way we can explain the hippie is by looking at the very interesting, very colorful character, Timothy Leary. He was a former Harvard psychologist and a very conventional academic until he began to experiment with the chemical compound popularly known as LSD, or sometimes magic mushrooms. He says 5 hours after eating the mushrooms, it was all changed. The revelation had come, the veil had been pulled back, the classic vision, the full blown experience, the prophetic call, the works. God had spoken. Timothy Leary meant it. God, according to him, was in the nervous system. And so Leary became an apostle for the psychedelic experiments, promoting and advocating the use of psychedelic drugs for expansion of consciousness. As we had said earlier, President Johnson hoped to achieve a victory very quickly in Vietnam. He wanted to win before the political consequences of escalation came due and he lost the next election, which would be the election of 1968. But victory continued to elude the administration. There was no sign of a North Vietnamese surrender. There's no sign of North Vietnamese weakening. General William Westmoreland, commander of the U.S. forces in Vietnam, insisted, however, that he saw a light at the end of the tunnel. The facts, however, told a different story. American deaths swelled to hundreds a week, and even though the Americans were winning every major military engagement, the North Vietnamese showed absolutely no sign of weakening, and they showed no sign of giving up. American officials privately believed that this was a war of attrition, or a numbers game. Who can kill the most? Then on January 30th, 1968, the North Vietnamese launched a massive, very well coordinated assault on South Vietnam known as the Tet Offensive. This was so named for the Vietnamese holiday Tet, or the Vietnamese New Year. The Americans were caught completely by surprise. Now, strictly speaking, Tet was a failure for the North Vietnamese. The Americans managed to push them back and win that military engagement. However, psychologically, it was a win for the North because they demonstrated that they were not weakening, they were showing no signs of giving up, and that the Americans were fighting, according to them, a futile battle. A well-respected TV anchorman, Walter Cronkite, went on TV and expressed much of what the nation was feeling. He said, "To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say we are mired in a stalemate seems the only realistic, yet unsatisfactory conclusion. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could." And then just months following the Tet Offensive, on March 30th, 1968, President Johnson went on television and made another shocking announcement. Vietnam had defeated him and had defeated his administration. He would not run for the presidency again in 1968, saying, "I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." And so the defeatism and the malaise that will characterize much of the 1970s can really be traced back to 1968, when an American president decided he was going to step down and really give up the fight. Johnson also opened up a power vacuum within the Democratic Party and within national politics as a whole. And then another bombshell, so to speak. On April 4th, 1968, the respected civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. He was killed by a white supremacist named James Earl Ray after he had participated in, King that is, a poor people's march for sanitation workers. And so, with this assassination, it seemed to many that America's best dreams were turning into nightmares. Riots broke out in response to King's assassination in Baltimore, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and other cities. It seemed to many people that the nation was spinning out of control and that violence and uncertainty was now the order of the day. One city that did not erupt into violence, however, was Indianapolis. And that's because Robert Kennedy, brother of the slain president, was running for president and spoke directly into the angry crowd. On this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it is perhaps well to ask what kind of nation we are and what kind of direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, you can be filled with bitterness, with hatred, and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country in great polarization. Black people amongst black, white people amongst white, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that has come across our land, with an effort to understand with compassion and love. So with that speech, with that announcement that he was calling for greater understanding and greater peaceful reconciliation, Robert Kennedy then emerged as the forerunner in the Democratic race for president in 1968. But he was assassinated on June 5, 1968, by Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian nationalist who disliked Robert Kennedy's position toward Israel. Both MLK and RFK had spoken eloquently about the Vietnam War and in opposition to it, and their deaths had helped radicalize the anti-war movement. Polite teach-ins and protests turned into angry street demonstrations and sometimes violence. Anti-warriors openly burned their draft cards and protest against what they believed was an unjust war. An offshoot of SDS, or the Students of a Democratic Society, formed the Weather Underground. And the Weather Underground targeted, vandalized, and destroyed government property and businesses that were associated with the war effort. And so the storm began to gather as the nation geared up for the election of 1968, which would be a referendum on the Vietnam War. So in August 1968, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago was consumed by divisions within the party. On the far left, so to speak, was Minnesota's Eugene McCarthy, who promised to end the war immediately. and he was the anti-warriors' first choice. Now, the moderate left, so to speak, was led by Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's VP, vice president, who wanted to continue fighting while urging diplomacy in North Vietnam. But outside of the convention, there was another battle being fought, the Chicago War of 1968. Thousands of anti-war protesters invaded Chicago during the convention to draw attention away from the convention and toward the war. There was Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman, troublemakers of a sort, who led the Youth International Party, also known as the Yippies, and they staged a nomination of a pig named Pegasus, who they called their new president. Now, they meant to draw attention to the fact that the political process was a mockery, or so they said. The American democratic system was a farce. The antics by the crowd outside ranged from clever to treasonous. They held aloft signs spelling America with a K, recalling Germany and Nazi Germany. They pledged support for Uncle Ho, meaning Ho Chi Minh. Some of the black protesters held signs aloft that said, "No Viet Cong ever called me," and that bad name. And then there were people who displayed the Vietnam flag. The Democratic mayor, Richard Daley, was prepared for such nonsense, or so he thought. He had every policeman working that night, and they had orders to break up the demonstrators and to do so with force if necessary. And so several nights of skirmishes culminated on election night, when the violence broke into such high fever pitch that it became known as the Chicago War. Outside, the protesters were screaming, "The whole world is watching! The whole world is watching!" And as the police were beating them and dragging them off and refusing them, as they think, their right to free speech, they were screaming this, letting everybody know that this is what America had turned into. The effect of the Chicago War was immediate and far-reaching. To many people, President Nixon will later call them the silent majority, the anti-war movement became synonymous with radicalism and treason. Even as public opinion shifted into opposition to the war, that is, most people began to dislike the war very much, it's important to note that most people did not identify with the anti-war movement. So you could say, yeah, I don't like the Vietnam War, but I'm not one of those protesting hippies. And so in response to this, the Democrats unenthusiastically nominated Hubert Humphrey as president. The Republicans were not tone deaf either. Their answer was the old favorite from the days of Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, who had run against John F. Kennedy in 1960 and lost, and now he's back again. Richard M. Nixon is truly this larger-than-life figure. He pledged to uphold the views of the so-called silent majority, those who were sick of the war but were not going to be found out protesting in the streets with those kids, those hippies. He would not admit defeat in Vietnam, but rather hinted at a secret plan that would end the war with honor, or so he said. And he let the hippies have it on national TV by promising to wage another war on pot, pornography, protest, and permissiveness. He said, "And now I would like to address the young people of this nation who are concerned about this war. I respect your idealism. I share your concern for peace. I want peace as much as you do. I want to end it so that the energy and dedication of you, our young people, now too often directed into bitter hatred against those responsible for the war, can be turned into the great challenges of peace. A better life for all Americans, a better life for all the people of this earth." Well, you have Democrats and you have Republicans, and then you have this wild card in the election of 1968, and his name is George Wallace. George Wallace was the governor of Alabama who first came to national attention when he defied the Supreme Court by refusing to allow black students to enroll at the University of Alabama in 1968. He refused integration. He protected the university from black students with the Alabama National Guard. He's famous for his one-line call to arms: segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Wallace seemed to channel the frustration of the average working class white guy. He directed his campaign to the average man on the street, so he said. This man in the textile mill, this man in the steel mill, this barber, this beautician, this policeman on the beat. Wallace directed the anger and the frustration of the supposedly forgotten man. His enemies, so he said, were the liberals, intellectuals, and longhairs who have run this country for too long. But Wallace is too smart to appeal to coded racism or militarism. He looked, rather, to the deep roots of Southern populism in order to make his appeal. He promised job training, stronger unemployment benefits, national health insurance, a higher minimum wage, and the expansion of union rights. Now, these are all things usually championed by the left, by the liberals. And so we have this odd mixture of an expansion of the welfare state from a pro segregationist Southern governor. What are we to make of this guy? Well, he knew what to make of himself. He would appeal both to people who are sick and tired of talking about civil rights, sick and tired of talking about all of this rights revolution, and at the same time, he can win supporters from some of Kennedy's camp. And in fact, he did. The American Independent Party aimed at and started to appeal to people who would have otherwise voted for Robert F. Kennedy. Very strange indeed. And so, as you can see by the map there, Wallace takes the solid South, largely for his pro-segregationist stand. And then Richard M. Nixon claims the majority of the electoral votes and also of the popular votes. And Richard M. Nixon is the president in 1968.
Nixon made ending the war in Vietnam a top priority. He told the public that he wanted a peace with honor, not a cut and run, but not exactly a triumphant victory. So he enlisted the aid of the National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger, a shrewd and ambitious Harvard academic. Kissinger's plan was called Vietnamization. It would be a gradual reduction in U.S. troops, correlated with an increase in South Vietnamese troops to give the appearance that the United States is disengaging. But, as the U.S. ambassador to Vietnam said, that just changes the color of the bodies. Kissinger and Nixon's plan, however, was to de-escalate in hopes of bringing the North to negotiations. And so just as Nixon publicly gave the impression that the war was winding down, he then stunned the public with his next move. He widened the war. He ordered the secret bombing of northern supply depots in Cambodia and ordered American troops to enter and wipe out the communist bases. He had hoped to signal to his voting base that he wanted a way out, but also assure the hawks that he would not give up the fight. But public protest only intensified, and President Nixon's presidency would see some of the largest and most virulent protests against the Vietnam War. One of these protests took place at Kent State in Ohio. What became known as the Kent State Massacre certainly threw the Vietnam protests and the war itself into a new light, where panicky state troopers fired into an anti-war rally, wounding 11 people and killing 4. At least 61 shots were fired into the crowd, giving many the impression that this was an assault on the protesters. At least one person was killed who was not even a protester, this giving us some of the more iconic images from the Vietnam War. Meanwhile, one of the worst atrocities of the war became public news. In 1968, American troops near the South Vietnamese village of My Lai executed nearly 500 people, including women and children. Why did this happen? Why did they do this? The soldiers were often confused about who was an enemy and who was not. Many South Vietnamese were Viet Cong sympathizers, but many were not. Most simply wanted to live in peace. My Lai raised a lot of questions about the war aims, and the overall meaning of the war. Why are we fighting? Who are we fighting? What does it mean to win? How do we define victory? If we kill every communist in Southeast Asia, can we declare victory, or is some other measure being employed? One soldier expressed the confusion aptly. He told the press, it became necessary to destroy the town in order to save it. Through it all, the North Vietnamese never wavered in their commitment to unite the country. They were also supplied by the Soviet Union and China, making their defeat even more difficult to obtain. Nixon understood that it was time to end it, and so he sent Kissinger to Paris to negotiate a settlement as the election of 1972 approached. The North agreed to an interim agreement with the South. The U.S. agreed to allow the North Vietnamese troops into the South while a special commission worked out a permanent settlement. At length, the U.S. withdrew entirely. Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese on April 30th, 1975. Was it a loss? A partial win? Well, however you want to frame it, the U.S. did not achieve its war aims, which was to contain communism to the north. These are pictures of the last images of a U.S. presence in Vietnam. You can see Americans evacuating through a helicopter before the North Vietnamese advance. And this is the images that sank into the American psyche. It's not a triumphant victory. It's not raising the banner of American exceptionalism. It's really a cut and run. The Vietnam War ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. So after the war, popular culture was generally silent about Vietnam. It was too fresh, perhaps even too painful to directly talk about. So how does America deal with its first military loss? Even so, as the war entered its last phase, popular culture began to respond with the popular television show MASH, which ran from 1972 to 1983, so named for the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. MASH was not actually about Vietnam. It was sort of a euphemism for the Vietnam War, an allegory of the Vietnam War. It was actually about Korea. It was a safe place to explore issues related to the war without being too directly controversial. So if you simply exchange Korea for Vietnam, you have that allegory making sense. It was a sharp critique of military bureaucracy. The war, it seemed, was run by distant, clueless pencil pushers who didn't have any idea of what it meant to have boots on the ground. And the surgical death and gore that so often were characteristic of MASH were metaphors for this battlefield waste. It showcased the mistrust and skepticism of war and of the United States Army. On the big screen, film showed a darker side of the Vietnam experience. In 1976, Robert Scorsese directed The Taxi Driver, starring Robert De Niro. This is about Travis Bickle, a Vietnam vet who returns home to an ungrateful nation. He slowly descends into madness as he develops this crazy plan to assassinate a presidential candidate. He showcases his contempt for American society, for American politics, and for his country as a whole. He reveals not only America's distaste for the war in which he participated, but also the psychological wounds that the soldiers continue to bear as they try to integrate into society. In short, we can see this as a former soldier at war with himself and with his country over the meaning of the war in Vietnam. De Niro went on to star in another film in 1979 called The Deer Hunter. In this film, you have three protagonists, the three who are Vietnam soldiers, and they're captured by the Viet Cong and forced to play this game of Russian roulette. They survive, return home, but have to deal with these near-death experiences. The movie makes very little or no attempt to make sense of the Vietnam experience. It seems to be rooted in the idea that the whole conflict was absurd. And it seems to say this: the meaning of the Vietnam War is nothing. Absurdity. Why did we do this? We don't know. It's even moot to even raise the point. Madness, absurdity, and meaningless will define the Vietnam experience in some of the films to follow. One of these films in which madness is one of the primary themes and motifs is Apocalypse Now, which was released to audiences in 1979. It's about a platoon that journeys down the Vietnamese River, which itself is a metaphor for the war itself. So it's something like Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. And so as these guys proceed deeper, each of the characters begins to manifest a different sort of madness. It's also a critique of American consumer values. It's the sort of thing that the U.S. is supposedly promoting in Vietnam, capitalism. And so there's one scene in the film in which the Vietnamese villagers are quietly eating rice, sort of contented with their lot, while the American soldiers are ogling over these dancers that they brought in to entertain them. So this idea of like sordidness and reversal of values. At the heart of the film, however, is madness, absurdness, and meaningless. What did the war mean? The war means nothing. The war only gives us pain. The action movies of the 1980s, however, gave us First Blood, also known as Rambo, released to audiences in 1980. In Rambo, a Vietnam vet comes home from the war and just tries to fit in. He tries to get a job and remain quiet and live out his life, but he is rejected and even abused by society. He's harassed by law enforcement and then forced to wage war on the society that has rejected him. He uses the skill and the cunning that he learned in Vietnam against this very society. Here is the suggestion that the Vietnam War created an army of monsters, and that unless those monsters are tamed or their problems are addressed by the public at large, we can expect revenge from Vietnam. In other words, Americans' chickens are coming home to roost. Then we cannot forget Rambo First Blood Part 2, the cinematically inferior but equally violent sequel to Rambo. In this movie, Rambo returns to Vietnam. That's right, he goes back on a special mission to rescue American POWs, or prisoners of war, American soldiers that have been held captive by the North Vietnamese since the Vietnam War ended. So we're talking about a 10-year term as a prisoner of war. But Rambo was set up to fail. The U.S. government refuses to acknowledge the POWs and in the end refuses to acknowledge Rambo's mission. And so Rambo has no other choice but to rescue the POWs himself and then wage war on the U.S. Army while escaping the North Vietnamese Army. So this allegory is pretty transparent. The U.S. has unaddressed problems in Vietnam represented by the POWs. The U.S. has treated its vets very badly and betrayed them, in fact, and that is represented by the character of Rambo himself. So beware, the film says, as in the First Blood movie. America's past sins will revisit her. There's something else that's interesting about this film, and that's that there's this need to win Vietnam. Rambo goes back and actually wins. So at least on film, we have this surrogate war playing out in which some kind of redemption is possible. So rather than meaningless, absolute meaningless, we have the sense of betrayal and the sense of a need to go back and somehow win. And Rambo, at least psychologically, fulfills this need for us. Another film we can look at is Platoon, released in 1986 and starring Charlie Sheen. And this features Chris Taylor, who's an idealistic young man who has put off college in order to go serve his country in the Army, and so he volunteers for Vietnam. And so, like I said, he's idealistic. He wants to make a difference in the world. I don't want to be another white boy on Wall Street, which is kind of an ironic statement given that Charlie Sheen's character is also in Wall Street, which will be released in just a year from now. He says in the movie, I guess having always been sheltered and special, I just want to be anonymous, like everybody else, do my share for my country, live up to what Grandpa did in the First War and Dad the Second. So, in time, this idealism is going to take some major blows. He experiences things he is not proud of. He participates in things he is not proud of, like a My Lai-esque pillage and destruction of an entire North Vietnamese village. So as in Apocalypse Now, the war is the transformative agent that turns the characters from idealistic young men into almost monsters. They are hardened to the realities of war. They realize that they are capable of unspeakable evil. And in the end, Chris is not idealistic or hopeful. It is even questionable as to whether or not he is even a good person. And so this is another film in which the war's evils are underscored. There is no meaning, no redemption, but, curiously, one of the main characters dies in cruciform, in other words, sort of giving the image of the cross. So is there some way to understand the sacrifice the film seems to be asking about this war? By the time we get up to 1989, we're starting to take a different look. The 1989 film Casualties of War revisits this Vietnam syndrome, this sense of defeatism. The protagonist features Lieutenant Riley, who's every bit as plucky and as idealistic as Chris Taylor. He's played by the familiar and comfortable actor Michael J. Fox, who is the boy next door. He played Alex P. Keaton in Family Ties. And so now the audience must psychologically endure sending Alex P. Keaton off to war. And the film indirectly addresses My Lai. American soldiers, perhaps confused in the fog of war, invade a Vietnamese village and take a young woman as a sex slave. And at length, after she's been used up, she's murdered. But Casualties of War really shifts our view of Vietnam. It attempts something of an apology and maybe even redemption. Lieutenant Riley must not only deal with his initial silence and complicity with the rape and murder, but he must also endure the wrath of his platoon and his own government when he struggles to make this crime public. In the end, Riley prevails. The murderers are brought to justice, but nevertheless, Riley still struggles with the memory of what happened in that Vietnam jungle. And in the film's denouement, Riley is riding on a bus years later, and he sees sitting across from him a young Vietnamese girl. And when she gets off the bus, he actually follows her and says something to her in Vietnamese. She turns to him and doesn't look at all surprised, but says, "It's over now, I think. It's over now, I think." What are we to make of this? Is this something of an apology to Vietnam? Is it an apology to the soldiers who participated in a supposedly meaningless war? Is it a final peace offering with the past? Whatever we can say about this film, we can say that it's struggling to overcome the absurdity of the war and to make some kind of meaning of it. The last film we're going to look at is in the 21st century. This is where we see the war beginning to transform on the screen. We Were Soldiers, released in 2002, creates or recasts the men in uniform as sort of echoes of John Wayne, hero soldiers. It does not address the meaningless or absurdity, atrocity, or mental illness that has so long characterizes war films about this conflict. It is rather based on real events, and it focuses on the heroism and outstanding leadership of Lieutenant Harold G. Moore. The battlefield is primarily an emotional one. Spouses, children, and friends must endure as the men willingly answer to the call to duty. And so, as the real Vietnam War becomes more of a memory than a current event, and the soldiers move on to become senior citizens, Hollywood, too, seems to be, and it's really too soon to tell, transforming the Vietnam experience into something of a good war. And for this, I credit my thesis director, Dr. Lisa Munday, at St. Thomas for leading me to this conclusion. I did not come up with it on my own. But nevertheless, this concludes my presentation on the Vietnam War in memory, the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War in pop culture.